Hello everyone, I hope you're having a good one. In today's video we are going to talk about the essentials, the basics of PvP, and I will try to cover everything there is to know and that Elder Scrolls Online has to provide us, math-wise. So the purpose of this video is to provide a complete understanding, a complete mathematical understanding of everything we do in the Elder Scrolls Online, provided of course you develop core combat skills such as blocking, bar swapping, CC timing, weaving, and positioning during combats. Acknowledging this, let's break ESO maths down for good. Before we start, there is something of utmost importance that we must talk about, and that is the sets. A lot of people have asked me, what is the most important thing a pro player must have in this game? And most of them think it is the set. And that is not true. I have to stand up and state that it is not true. It is not true. Sets are important, yes, of course, but as most 30%. The other 70% depends really on your skill. And what is a skill to be exact? Because a lot of people talk about skills and they don't even know what skills really mean. Well, there's the logical mathematical part of skills, which is often used by theory crafters, and they conceive it as an art because behind the theory crafting there's a lot of calculation, a lot of math, a lot of testing, and especially if you play in consoles you won't have the add-ons a lot of people have on PC, so you will have to do this like the old way. Okay, so the understanding of the core mechanics, the core combat of the game is half of your skill. Like the plain understanding of this is half of your skill. And the other half, well, that's when your thumbs get into play. Both your thumbs and your brain, because it is about your reflexes, your speed, your instincts, how you think, and how you outsmart your opponents. That's the other half of what it takes to have a skill. That, and of course, muscle memory. However, it has to be said that at a very high tier of PvP, sets actually do matter more than it should, because certain sets are weak to others, and these weak sets to these others are strong against others. So they play a strong role in whatever you do in the game, obviously. So what are these sets? Or at least which are the most infamous or controversial sets we should be talking about? Well, we have several. As 5 pieces sets, we could talk about Reliquant, Tyrant, Essence Thief, Rallying Cry, Stuns, Order's Wrath, Mara's Bomb, among others. Now, monster sets are even more controversial. Like, these are really infamous. For example, Sans. That thing needs a nerf. So does Geralt's. Actually, I believe Geralt's is even worse. Like Wall Suit, Geralt's is just hands down a very overpowered set that shouldn't be allowed in the game. We also have Malubeth and Baylor, but these two ain't as broken as the previous two we mentioned. We also have the arena weapons, like the Black Rose Prison weapons, which, for what I can tell, they're just really good. They're not broken or anything. We have the Master Dual Wield from Dragonstar Arena, which I'd have to say they're definitely broken and they shouldn't be that strong. They nerfed them, but they essentially became stronger if you build for it. So yeah, they are just nasty strong, and the dot they proc it's also very strong. Now, a lot of people complain about the Battlestrand arena weapons, the Battlestrand staff to be precise. And, well, even though in paper it looks like a no-brainer, because it is essentially a free breach and a free dot, well, you gotta take into an account that it's also taking a space in your bar. A lot of people won't even care because, well, what is the matter with it? Like, okay, it's still free, but hey, there is a reason PvEers don't use it for PvE, and that's because it is not convenient when you have other options. Like, for example, how would you justify the use of elemental susceptibility over Noxious Breath if your purpose behind the usage of this skill is to get a breach source, a major breach source, and then you start balancing to which will be better suited for you. But all in all, even if people stone me for what I'm about to say, I don't think the Battlestrand staff is broken, because it doesn't deal the damage that you would expect from a slow level skill. Yeah, it's free. Well, that's the reason, because it doesn't deal any damage but the damage that the procs do. The dots it procs do. And then we got, of course, the Maelstrom Arena weapons that features the best, well, at least for my liking, the best two-handed arena weapon set in the game. Even though they're amazingly strong, I have to say that I don't believe these weapons are broken or anything. They're just really good, but they're not broken at all. No, they're not. They're just very good. Now that we are in the same page, it is time to move on to the reason we're all here. And the first thing I'm gonna show you is a brief preview of our character's attributes sheet. Alright, first things first, I'm going to do a quick overview of everything you're looking at right now, and then I will proceed to explain their functions and impact in your performance individually. Also, the maths behind all of these numbers and how they interact with each other, which are the relationships they hold with each other. So the first thing we get to see once we get into the character attributes sheet are the resources, both the pools and the recoveries. Me as a MacDK, this is my main. I main a MacDK, a Magica Dragon Knight. You can see that I have more Magica than Stamina, and that is because, well, my skills cost Magica instead of Stamina, but certain skills like Vigor or perhaps Quick Cloak, if I'm running the cloak, will cost Stamina, but the majority of my skills will always cost Magica. I also have a decent amount of health. This can vary, as some people can PvP with as low as 25k health, or they decide to go with 40k health. That's really up to them. It's really up to you. I prefer a balance and not to cheese that much of health. I don't really like that, but well, for likings the colors, you can do whatever you want. Now on the right side of the pools, we have the recoveries of each of these pools. That can also vary depending on what you are running, what class, what race, and what specialty, like if you are a stamina or magica version of that specific class, or even if you're running an hybrid, it will always vary. Among players, the recoveries will always be different. Then below we have the spell damage and the weapon damage that are often the same value. They normally have the same value, but they can also vary depending on what class you're running. For example, Dragon Knights benefits from minor brutality regardless if they are Magica or Stamina, so as a Dragon Knight you will always want to invest in weapons damage instead of spell damage. And these stats hold a relationship with the pools, a relationship that I will explain later on in the video. Then we have the spell critical and the weapon critical that can also vary depending on if you're running Major Prophecy and Savagery on your tooltip or if you're running a pot instead. Then you have the penetrations, and then below this second section of attributes we have the resistances, the spell and the physical resistance that can also vary depending on your class, your race, your build, and of course the critical resistance that will be affected by certain specific sets or champion points. Very well, with all this being said, the first attributes we will look into detail will be the resources pools. When we talk about resources pools, we are referring to the different gauges of magicka, health and stamina, the maximum amount of these resources, while each will provide a different specific bonus that will help us extend our possibilities during a combat, as I will proceed to explain now. One of the first things that come to our minds when we talk about health is survivability. And even though it would normally mean that, in PvP things are a little bit different than it would be on PvE, since even if you accumulate a huge amount of health, say, I don't know, 60k health, an exaggerated amount, but you unbalance the rest of your attributes, say resistance, say damage, then you won't only have a lot of health, but you will also have a poor recovery, a poor damage, and poor resistance, meaning that you will eventually die quicker than someone with 20k health with all these other attributes well balanced. However, the health gauge doesn't literally mean that you will only have more health points to spare. You will also gain benefits to most of the shields of the game that will scale off the health. There are also quite a few skills from, for example, wardens or necromancers, which damage escalates from health, but we're not taking those into account today because these skills that scale, the part of these skills that scale from health are just so minimal, minuscule, and marginal that, well, unless you're building a tank, I wouldn't take them into account. And again, building a tank for PvP isn't the best option unless you wanna play a support role and you have a team for this specifically. And for last but not least, regarding the health, there is the undead passive for on vampires that will escalate off your max health in a detrimental relationship. That means that if you have, say, 100k health, an exaggerated amount given the example, and you are at 50k, then you will start mitigating 7% of the damage at 50% of your health. That means that the more health you have as a vampire, the better you will benefit from its mitigation. Now, regarding our magicka and stamina pools, both of these resources will behave similarly in a damage environment. It means that if you're a magicka user, the more magicka pool you have, the better your damage, and if you're a stam user, the better your stamina pool, the better your damage. However, there are certain differences we have to address between the magicka and the stamina pool. First, magicka. Most of the heals in the game will cost magicka, regardless of your class or main resource. Meaning that even if you are a stam class, say Stamplar, a stam DK, stam blade, a stam sword, whatever, you will still benefit from the magica whenever you heal. Of course, there are also stamina versions for the skills we've been talking about. However, they normally underperform drastically in comparison to their magica counterparts. Nevertheless, just as stamina users have to be careful of how they spend their magica, provided they heal with it, magica users have to also be careful with the way they play their core combat skills, the way they move, because just as the stam users need the magica for their heals, magica users need their stam for their movements. This happens because essentially everything related to core combat skills requires stamina, and I'm talking about blocking unless you have an ice staff. I'm talking about roll dodging, I'm talking about sprinting. All of these cost stamina, so as a mag user who wants to accumulate magica pool in order to deal more damage, you also want to watch out for your stam, since if you cannot break free or you cannot roll dodge in the proper time, then you will die nonetheless, even if you have your mag pool full. But same goes for stam. Even if you have all the stam in the world to break free and roll dodge, if you don't have magica to heal, you will eventually die. And dead men tell no tales, so let's avoid dying, at least from being out-resourced. Next up, we have our recoveries. All the attributes are equally important. However, sustain is king. If you cannot hold yourself through a tough fight, it's gonna end quick with you dead. That's because if you get rooted, say stunned, for 3 seconds, and you cannot break free, you will die. If you cannot roll dodge on time, you will die. If you cannot heal your health back up, you will die. If you're a shield user and you cannot put your shield back on, you will die. So, sustain is king. Some people recommend 1200 or more of your main resource. Some people recommend 1800 of your main resource or more. As you can see, I don't have that much of recovery because I have other ways to recover. That's because of my build. Also, I'm a Dragon Knight, so my ultimates regenerate my pools. But talking about how to sustain, I will teach you the 3 main ways that pro PvP players use to sustain in the Elder Scrolls Online. The first and most important way to sustain the Elder Scrolls Online is through pressure. This means that you want as little recovery as you can and feel comfortable with. That doesn't mean you won't invest anything on recovery, but instead that you will invest just as necessary, nothing more, nothing less. And you will sustain through the pressure, avoiding getting hit, avoid being hit, so you don't need to heal yourself. And you keep the pressure on, so you drain your opponent resources in the process. That's what sustain through pressure means. Not to allow your opponents to hit you that often, and instead being you the one putting up the pressure. This translates into a fewer cadency of impacts from your opponent's end, also augmenting the frequency of their heals, which also translates at the same time on better resource sustain for you, because you won't be spending your resources on buffing, healing, or whatever, but hitting, as your opponent is spending those resources you're not spending on healing themselves. You will not only sustain the fight, but also out-resource your enemies. This might sound easy or basic, but the reality is that the majority of the population of our beloved game cannot do it. Then we have the brute sustain, which is, in my opinion, the most common kind of sustain out there. I will dare to say that it's being used by the 85% of the population of the game, and it consists on essentially stacking recovery values. This is an okay strat because, yeah, well, you can essentially guarantee you won't run out of your main resource, and that's nice, but it won't matter if that means you had to sacrifice a lot of damage for it. So much damage you cannot kill someone specifically in a tough fight, or you're sacrificing so much resistance that you will end up in the same place because you won't die out of resource, but you will die in matter of seconds anyways. So yeah, if you feel you are in this layer of brute sustain, well, do your best to climb to the sustain through pressure, and you will see how your whole game improves a lot. The difference is simply huge. The difference between brute sustain and sustain through pressure is simply huge. And then for the last but not least, or at least that's what I would like to say because for me it is least, there is kiting. So kiting in the Elder Scrolls is, well, basically the coward's sustain, and it consists of running from fights and giving loops around different objects, either in Citadel, Imperial City, or even Battlegrounds. I've seen people kiting in duels, like... Anyways, this is more frequently used by glass cannons, archers, and builds of the sort. I personally don't like it, I really don't, but I mean, at the end of the day, it is all about having fun, and if you are having fun with one build of the sort, well, be my guest, go on, have fun. I just don't like it, and even less prefer it over other ways of sustaining. Moving on to the damage section of your attributes sheet, we will find the spell damage and the weapon damage on the first place. Back in the day, this will determine the damage of either Magicka or Stamina abilities. Nowadays, they're just exactly the same, and depending on which of the two is higher, then the math is going to take into account that one higher attribute. So it will really depend on which class you're playing at that you may focus on one of them. Sometimes they will be exactly the same value. Now, from this point on forward, things are getting a little bit more complex, not that complicated, but still, you are going to have to make use of some mathematical knowledge because we will start doing some calculations, and I will explain you how weapon and spell damage factorizes with your pools and the rest of your attributes. Alright guys, now we are ready to start breaking down our real damage value. But we cannot find our real values if we don't get the nominal values first. So in order to find our nominal values, we gotta use our weapon and spell damage values plus our max pool value. So we're gonna factorize the spell damage, the weapon damage, and the max pool in one same formula. A very easy, simple formula that everyone is going to understand. All of you are going to understand it, and I will do my best to make myself clear. So, if your spell damage is higher than your weapon damage, then your spell damage plus the max pool value, either Magicka or Stam, will equal your nominal damage. That's your nominal damage. We gotta do this conversion because you cannot sum the value of either spell or weapon damage with any of the pools, since these are different types of units. one thing stands for resource and the other as a raw damage statistic. So we need to bring the max pool to the same ground of the weapon or the spell damage. Hence, we will use our golden formula, which states that our max pool divided by 10.5, which is the globally accepted value to convert resources pool into a unit that can be summed with weapon or spell damage to get then our necessary MPV. I mean the max pool value. Every 10.5 points of magicka or stamina equals 1 point of weapon and spell damage. So let's say you have 10k maximum magicka. Let's give a random example and let's imagine that this 10k maximum magicka is your max pool, provided you have, I don't know, 5k health and 5k stam. These are obviously made up numbers. I'm like literally just making them up right now so you can understand the formula. So let's say 10k max magicka is your max pool value. Alright, then that's your max pool. You are going to divide that 10k by 10.5 and that will give you the MPV, what we will call MPV. We will call it like this so we can bring it to the same round of the weapon damage and the spell damage. So now the MPV, the max pool value, has the same denomination, the same unit that both the weapon damage and the spell damage has. So just as before, if the weapon damage is higher than the spell damage, then you will have to sum the weapon damage plus the MP, the max pool value we just calculated by dividing the max resource pool by 10.5. And that is going to give us a nominal value. That nominal value will stand for the nominal damage of our toon, either if it was calculated with the spell damage or the weapon damage. And this here, my friends, is the famous relationship between weapon spell damage and the max resource pool. But we just got a nominal value. We haven't found the real one yet, so let's move on. Amazing. We just found out our first nominal value. However, there is something in every MMORPG in the world, and ESO not being an exception, that's called critical damage. It depends on two factors: the critical chance, essentially being a critical hit ratio, and the critical damage, which is essentially the enhancement of the regular damage. So, how do you calculate both of these? This is even easier than what we did before, because the base values are already settled as default. Not only that, I have played MMORPGs all my life, and for the last 20 years I have learned different techniques and ways to calculate the critical chances, RNG, and the damage in a very particular, accurate way that I want to teach you. So let's get into it. Alright, so in order to calculate the two fundamental values that the Elder Scrolls Online provide to us players, we gotta take into account the first thing, which is the base value. The base value for the critical chance is going to be 10%, and the base value for the critical damage is going to be 50%, whereas the cap value of the critical chance is just infinite, it doesn't exist, and for critical damage it is 125%. Well, this basically means that if you create a Khajiit and you put on Order's Wrath and Mother's Sorrow, two daggers with precise, you will surpass this cap, and after that you will essentially receive diminishing returns because you will be losing damage. You won't be achieving what you're actually looking for because you won't be dealing any additional damage. And well, the CCV is infinite. Some other games cap it at 50%, especially tactical games. But talking about tactical games, I want to explain you what CCSV is. This is something that's not included in any of the tools that the Elder Scrolls Online has to offer, at least not to us add-on-free console players. Well, the CCSV stands for Critical Chance Statistical Value, whereas 50% stands as 1-2. 1 out of 2 of your hits will hit yellow, I mean critical. And if you had 33%, it will be 1 out of 3. If you had 25%, it will be 1 out of 4. This last 25% is definitely the least desired viable scenario. And I say the least desired viable scenario because you can still build strong builds with it. You can have a really good build hitting 1 out of 4 crits. Now, 33 to 50 is like the ideal, like the best possible scenario. Of course, it's gonna be 50%. But after 33%, you're effectively hitting 1 out of 3 hits, 3 out of 9 hits, okay? 30 out of 100 hits as critical. Maybe a little bit more if you raise it a little bit. Now, if you go for a crit build, then you want to aim to 50%, but you don't really want to surpass it because if you accumulate more critical chance beyond 50%, all you're gonna get is diminishing returns. Not directly from the critical chance. You might have a better chance of critical, yes, but you will be dealing less damage with a greater amount of critical hits. This, well, is essentially because you will have to sacrifice other stats in order to get anywhere beyond 50%. And this way of viewing this radio has always come in super handy, at least to me, so I can calculate or estimate really quick how my critical chance and damage are impacting my performance. We're getting closer at figuring out our real damage output. Now that we have found a new nominal value, the critical nominal value, we will use it along the rest of the nominal values to find out our real damage output. However, we're still missing a couple of fundamental stats, fundamental values, fundamental attributes, which are the physical and spell penetration and the physical and spell resistance, both of which exist on a detrimental relation with each other. That means that the physical penetration exists as a detriment of the physical resistance and the spell penetration exists as a detriment of the spell resistance. After we proceed to understand this, I will explain you the critical resistance and how it affects your performance, then the percentual changes, and voila, yalla, we will be ready to calculate our real damage formula. Okay, let's hit those numbers again. So I decided to put a fixed number in both the physical and the spell penetration, 13k. This will always be the exact same number. Alright? Now, for the physical resistances and the spell resistances, I decided to put a combined scenario in which you will find an under-penetrating by the physical side and an over-penetrating by the spell side, the spell resistance side. So the damage dealer here, the penetrating combatant with 13k penetration, will essentially over-penetrate the stam user. There's 1k penetration that's going to nowhere. It's a lost stat because he's over-penetrating. In these scenarios, you want to balance your build because you are not doing anything with that 1k extra pain. So you want to avoid those scenarios, but in the other hand, you don't want to lack the penetration to reach the resistances of, for example, the 20k spell resistances if you have 13k pen. Okay? There are different sources of penetration in the game. We call them breaches, minor breach and major breach, and together they sum roughly 9k penetration. Okay, so let's say you have those 13k spell penetration, but you didn't unbuff your enemy. So if you unbuff your enemy with both minor and major breach, you will essentially surpass the spell resistances he has on the Magicka side, on the spell resistance. So that in that scenario, but we are not taking into account any sort of buff or anything. These are raw numbers. So provided the defendant is surpassing the offendant penetration by 7k, then we can say that the ESR below the EPR means effective physical resistance, which is 0 because he's naked, he's being over-penetrated. The ESR is 7k. Now, after all these years, the Elder Scrolls Online community have figured out certain key values that are static in the maths within the game, meaning that 433 resistances equals more or less roughly with a minimal error margin 1% mitigation, just as before when we did the weapon spell damage calculation, when the pool was 10.5 weapon spell damage per every weapon spell damage, just like that. So 7k effective spell resistances roughly equals a 16% damage mitigation. Of course, we're not taking into account in this specific example any source of percentual amplifications or mitigations, say berserks, forces, vulnerabilities, or brittles. But raw physical penetration and spell penetration, and raw physical resistance and spell resistance. So to give an example and let this very clear, because this is one of the most important things you gotta take into account when calculating the damage. Let's say you have an X skill, whatever skill, that hits for 10k. It says 10k damage in your tooltip, okay? Then you find yourself in this scenario in which you have 13k pen versus someone that has 20k resistances, and the skill deals magical damage, it deals spell damage, so it will take into account the 7k surplus this opponent has over you. So that's essentially a 16% decrease in the damage of your tooltip. So it will be dealing the 10k. In paper, it will do 8.4k. However, you gotta take into account Battle Spirit. So it will decrease your 10k by 50%, so it will become 5k. Hence, you will be dealing a total of 4.2k of damage. Of course, we are not taking into account any other source of percentual variations. Now, as long as these conditions are met, these will be the exact numbers that will appear in your screen. However, we haven't taken into account the critical resistances and the rest of the nominal values. So for now, this is what you need to know. Very well, we have come this far, and we are only one nominal value away from a real damage output. And that nominal value is the critical resistance. Critical resistance, a key attribute often overlooked by a lot of people, but every pro pay attention to it. That's because you have a base 20% critical mitigation with those 1300 you see as critical resistance in the screen. That's the base critical resistance. Okay, so to give you some lights regarding what can give you some extra critical resistance, every 66 points of critical resistance represents 1% of critical mitigation. Hence, every impen piece you have in your setup gives you a 2% of critical resistance, and following the same order of ideas, if you have 5 pieces with impen, that means you will get 10% extra critical mitigation. But let's not get too technical yet, and let's go to the math board. Alright guys, I broke this one down super easy for you. So, as I was saying before, our base critical resistance is 1320 points, which represent a 20% mitigation towards any other enemy. We gotta take into account one thing before we proceed to continue to explain the rest of the values, and it is that the critical resistance starts giving you diminishing returns after 50%. After 50%, the diminishing returns you will get from critical resistance stacking is heavy. It's really huge and you don't want it. So that's the reason why a lot of people um, get just happy with rallying cry and they don't put anything else like impen on the rallying cry. Like if you get the rallying cry, you can get two impens and no more, because after that the next impen, the third impen you can put in on a rallying cry set will give you just 1%, and from that point on forward every impen will give you that 1%. For example, if you max the resilience CP on a rallying cry and two impen, it will give you 10%. It will give you roughly 5%. So, or even less. So, mind the diminishing returns in everything we have spoken so far, but in the critical resistance scenario, the diminishing returns hit really hard, especially hard. So, these are the most common sources of critical resistance. The first being impen, giving a 2% increase in the critical resistance per piece. If you were 5, it's 10%. If you were 7, it is a 14%. Now you have the resilience CP, which will give you at the 5th stage 660 points of critical resistance, which represent a 10% increase on your critical resistance. And then the perhaps most famous Magica set ever created in the Elder Scrolls Online, Rallying Cry, which gives you a solid 25% critical resistance plus 300 weapon spell damage. So yeah, it's really OP, like perhaps the most solid set in the whole game. The last component of our formula are the percentual variations that you can get from certain specific sets, champion points, or buffs and debuffs such as Berserk, Force, Vulnerability, or Brittle. Let's go and take a look at the board and see how they impact our performance and the build quality. In an effort to simplify things, I will just explain you how percentual variations affect with the buffs and debuffs, but bear in mind that the same exact rules that I am going to explain you with these buffs and debuffs will also apply equally the same with any other source of percentual damage. Could be set or champion points. It is all the same. The same rules will apply to those percentual buffs, either if they're damage or mitigations. As you can see in the board, all these four elements, 2 buffs and 2 debuffs, hold a special, very close relation to each other. Since Berserk holds a directly inverse relationship with vulnerability, as so does Force with Brittle. The difference is that Berserk and vulnerability deals with general damage, while Force and Brittle deals with critical damage. Being Berserk a buff to yourself, as so is Force, while vulnerability and Brittle are debuffs on your opponent. Now, it is here when it gets tricky, because you might think they cannot stack or they are different things, but in reality they do stack, because if you hit with Berserk and you amplify your general damage, you're also amplifying your critical damage. And if you use a force on top of that, you will enhance the critical damage even further. So you will essentially enhance your critical damage twice. Yes, it is exactly just as it sounds. Of course, there is an Achilles heel, like with everything else in Tamriel, and that is the diminishing returns. As long as you make sure you don't surpass the 30% cap on the percentual variations, you will be perfectly fine. With the nominal values I gave you, you should now be able to use the formula of real damage that I left at the end of the video. I hope I help you build the build of your dreams and become the hero you were meant to be. Our beautiful journey has come to an end, but don't worry, it is just for the time being. Preyakatosh, so may the god of time bless us with a next one.